Do you constantly break promises to yourself? If you're not being consistent with yourself, it's going to show up in your relationships and friendships. Learn what you can do to keep promises with yourself so that you can do it for others. Discover how you can stop the no-shows or last-minute canceling on your friends by becoming predictable and reliable. Ooh, let's see if I'll get her name just right. Vanessa Benzan-Monteiro, aka Vanessa Sujey, is a passionate entrepreneurial social worker who is here for all things Black and brown millennial women, well, women with the X related. Some call her woo-woo, and she's good with that. A little bit of therapy here with a twist of moon phases and astrology over there, followed by a sprinkle of some bodywork and sound healing to top it off. She is the founder of 2 companies, Sustaining Hope and Wellness, as well as Gather and Heal. It is the company's mission to support women through their healing journey. She is here today to share how predictability helps create stronger, lasting connections. So, welcome to the stage, Vanessa.
Peace, y'all. Welcome. I am so excited to be here. Thank you for the introduction. One correction is it's Sujey, but I like to say Sujey so that way we can remember it. All right, so I'm gonna jump in and share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint that'll be going, but keep the picture on me larger than the PowerPoint because I do more talking and sometimes I don't even follow the PowerPoint. That, my friends, is how predictable I am, that I don't. I don't always follow and do what I'm supposed to do. But, all right. Okay. So, as mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of Gather and Heal. It's a space for melanated millennial women to come together and heal and have conversations and really, branch off of my traditional training, which is as a social worker that looks in at the individual and community. And what I was trying to do and what I do with Gather and Heal is bring them together, right? Because there's an element of the work that we can do individually. And then there's also an element that just really amplifies your journey when it's done in community. All right, so I'll be talking about predictability and you, right? So you at the center, how do I figure out my own alignment and how deep is my self-awareness so that way I can understand how I show up in relationships. But then the same diagram that I'll show you in a little bit will also help you to deepen your understanding and awareness of how those around you are showing up in a predictable manner, or maybe not so much. So the picture in the top right-hand corner is, of course, like my professional headshot. It's all of that good stuff. That's like the predictable photo that you expect to see. But a little bit more about me is that I love and thrive within my friendships. And the gift that is of me popping the champagne bottle is at the launch event for Gather and Heal. And these 4 women are my closest friends. And we've had long relationships, some since high school, some since like kindergarten, okay? And what's really helped us is knowing each other because we're doing such a good job of connecting with ourselves, right? I knew I could depend on all of them to be there, and they were. And just like they know that I can be there for them and that I will show up with my 100%. That's my little human. So I'm a mom, I'm also a partner. And I also really value the relationship that I have with myself, right? Because, as mentioned, how do we keep promises for ourselves? How do we maintain the boundaries for ourselves the same way that we hope and expect those around us to do the same? So let's do a little story time, which is really interesting coming off of the last presentation that Lee just shared with us in the interview, because it too is about a long-term friendship. And so I had a good friend, and when I was moving from Boston to Atlanta, they were supposed to make the drive with me, right? And the day of, she started sending me emails and saying, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure, can we postpone? And I was completely caught off guard, because that's not how this person shows up. It's not how they had showed up historically in our friendship. And it's also not how I had seen them show up in other relationships around them. And so, because they showed up in an unpredictable way, it started to set off my own balance, because I was then like, well, what do I do? What's happening? Did I do something wrong? And it required me to have to think very quickly, what is my next step? How am I going to navigate this dynamic within this friendship, but then also this new start to a chapter in my life that I was very excited about. And I was actually really excited to make the drive with this particular friend, because we had done it a number of times. And because we had done it a number of times and other trips and had so much fun and so on and so forth, I was not ready. Okay. I was not ready. And we were going to start the road trip at night. So I was supposed to pick them up around like 10 or 11 p.m. or something. Well, as we got closer to that hour, the emails stopped, right? Well, let me back up a second too, right? Because the emails was a little off. We text, we talk on the phone. So why are we emailing about this important topic, right? So after a while, the email stopped. She wasn't responding to me as I was calling and texting and so on. And so I have a very strong part that's like, all right, we got to pivot. What are we going to do? What's next? So I was actually pivoting, and I pivoted towards another friendship that continues to be very dear to my heart, because this person too has been very, very predictable for me. She's shown up consistently. We've been friends for about 30 years or so. And I knew that because I was so stuck and my emotions were so heightened with what was going on, that I knew I needed some support. My brain was not working all of a sudden. And so she helped me walk through a few things. And through that, she ended up saying to me like, hey, I can go home early, so you can drop me off on your way, right? So she lived in New York at that time. So Boston to New York, about 4.5 hours or so. And I was like, all right, let's go. Let's do this. By the time that decision was made, I completely hadn't heard from the original person who was supposed to be traveling with me. And I did my best to compartmentalize how I was feeling about that, because there were things that needed to be done. My car was packed, we were ready to go, and I was excited. So I compartmentalized this piece a little bit here. And I told my parts that I would circle back to it. I would sit with how I really felt and how this person not coming with me on this really big, important trip, how it was impacting me, like my whole overall system, right? So we hit the road and we start going and things are great. And, I landed in Atlanta, but now I'm in Tampa. I need beach and water around me. So when we think about the impacts of unpredictable behaviors and friendships, it ruined our friendship in that example, that particular example. I continued to kind of track how I was doing and how I was feeling. And I had so many parts that were activated around being hurt, not feeling seen. And there was a lot of disappointment around, she bailed, right? Like there's just no other way to put it, like she bailed. And I was so hurt, right? And I'll map out some more around that. But through that behavior, or actually series of behaviors, right? Because we're talking the email chains, which was different from our texts and our phone calls, the last minute lack of response, which was not in line with how we communicated, which is very consistent. It was the literally just not showing up. Knowing the consequence was I would then be making the drive from Massachusetts to Georgia alone overnight, right? And so I stopped talking to her. I reached out a little bit afterwards to try to see like what we could do, if things could be mended. And there was just something within me, right? As I checked in with my overall system, that I was like, I can't handle that level of friendship in which someone is not being predictable, right? That was a huge pivot. And now I'll put in a side note here and say that that's not always the case, right? Just because there are times when people, friends, romantic partners, whomever it might be, if they're not predictable 100% of the time, like, okay, we are human, going to happen. But it was the level and the impact and the importance of this particular experience that was too hurtful, too painful for me to be able to move through despite my efforts. And theirs, I will say, they did try to come back and put in some effort. I think it was probably like 6 months to a year later, actually. But I also talked a little bit about the healthy relationship, right? And the healthy predictability within the dynamic that I had with this other friend, where she showed up and was like, I got you. Let's put our heads together, which I knew she would say. I'll come through. That was unpredictable. I didn't expect her to come with me even for like a portion of the ride. But she did, right? And that experience and being able to move through that with her was so helpful for me in that time, in that moment of realizing that someone who I thought would be there and be consistent in my life and for a big life change, she wasn't, right? And so my social worker hat comes on. And the way that I view this is a painful experience, you know, something that maybe was broken, like our friendship was broken. Through being able to rewrite this narrative and have a reminder, a beautiful reminder that says, even if there are challenges and even if there are people who are not predictable, not only do I have people around me who are, that can support me through that, but I also continue to show up for myself, right? Because it was also super important for me to make this drive and start the trip when I had set and when I had planned, right? And that's what I stuck with, even if it meant making that drive by myself. But what happens if we don't have another friendship or another romantic relationship or colleague, whatever it might be, who can show up and help us, whether it be in that moment or even afterwards? So how do we do this? What does this mean? How do I gain my own awareness around how I'm showing up? Okay. Now I hope I didn't click too many times. All right. So this diagram here is one that I literally drew out. As you can see, it's not all well balanced, but it's my favorite. Okay. It's my favorite because it's a huge piece around how I recognize where I'm at. What am I trying to do? How am I moving through life and showing up in this world? Okay. It's a circle because we can go in all different directions. There's no correct or incorrect location in which we start, right? Sometimes when we're checking in with ourselves, we might have huge glaring behaviors that will help us then trail back and figure out, how am I feeling? What am I thinking? What is my body telling me? But there might be other times where the emotions are so intense that that's where you start to help you unravel and understand why your behaviors are a particular way, why you're thinking something, and what's happening in your body. So let's use this diagram to kind of talk a little bit about that hurt, but also the healing. And so that way we can see both sides of it, all right? As I go through these examples of the mind, body, emotions, and behaviors, it is important to note that all of these, I wasn't aware of all of them that evening or that day that I was going on my trip. Some of these, hindsight, right? I look back and I was like, oh yeah, see, that's why I did that, or now this is making some more sense, okay? So that day, I was experiencing fury, rage, and then it wasn't until later that it settled in and I noticed that beneath that fury and that rage was actually sadness and disappointment in this friend not showing up for this trip and making this ride with me. My mind, all of my thoughts were going and trying to really analyze, what did I do? What prompted this? Why didn't they communicate differently with me? How did we end up here? Like, it really doesn't make any sense. So my brain was going and it was thinking, right? Trying to make sense of this. My behavior that same day, of course, I noticed, and then this actually is consistent with how things continued surrounding withdrawal. I was like taking steps back and really disconnecting from this person. And that day, the way that it looked is it took longer to respond. And my efforts to say, how can we brainstorm around this were, as time went on, continuing to decrease, right? So I was paying attention to my behaviors. How was I showing up or not showing up, right? In my body, I felt tension. I felt really tired, right? Because now my mind also knew that I'm going to be making this drive alone. And it's an overnight drive, right? And I've been packing and doing all the things that day. So that's the example of how, when the lack of predictability in this friendship, when it happened, how it settled in my whole system, okay? Now on the healing end of it, right? I always like to balance things out where I can. The emotions when my good friend was able to come with me, oh my goodness, I was so excited. My body literally, and even as I talk about it, it's happening again. My body literally relaxed. It felt a little bit more at ease that I wouldn't be alone, right? For a portion of the trip. My behavior started to be a little bit more proactive in saying like, okay, so let's do this. We got to get you over here to collect your stuff. Let's keep moving, right? My body just like jumped right into action. And some of that excitement that I was feeling in my emotions also dropped into my system. And when I get really excited, it's lots of tingling in my stomach. And part of my behaviors is to really listen to upbeat music and just outwardly express the excitement that's within. And for me, that's, through music and lots of movement and excitement. So there's, the two sides, two examples of the hurt that was experienced, how it settled in my system, and then also what it looked like to be able to repair, right? Because I think what happens too a lot of the time is when we have a negative experience in any aspect of our lives, but we'll stick with this piece around these two friendships, is that it then brings into question how much can I really predict how other people are going to show up for me in my friendship, right? It starts to bring larger relationship dynamics into question. And I'm grateful for this other friendship that was able to come through and really remind me that there are times when things get hard, and things will get hard, and others might not be predictable, and you might not always be able to rely on them. But that doesn't mean that all friendships or all relationships are not dependable, and that you can't have a good idea of how things are going to map out or how someone will show up for you. So that repair, and again, like I said before, the rewriting of the narrative with this second friendship was so helpful, right? So the way, as you can see, all of this really has to do with you as the individual, your emotions, mind, body, and behavior. And that's where we have to start, right? How can I surround myself with people and be in environments and be in spaces that lean a little bit more to the side of being predictable if I don't even know what's happening in my system, right? So on the other hand, the example that I gave you was me reflecting back. But how do you use this diagram? How do you use the self-awareness piece in the moment, right? So I want you to take a moment and think about just kind of any one of these four in this moment. How are you feeling? Or what are you thinking about? What is your current behavior? And how are you feeling? Like, what's your body telling you? And again, there's no, like, you have to start at this one. You start wherever it is that you can identify first in this moment. So once you've identified one, see if the awareness of where you started can help you identify another one. And then continue that until you've hit all four. So my live example is I'm going to start with body and behavior. Those are usually my two biggest tells. Feeling nervous, shocker, and presented. So I'm fidgeting quite a bit, right? Got my stone here, feeling it, soothing, because it helps calm my system. How do I know I need to calm my system? Well, because I'm also aware that all of a sudden it's really freaking hot in here. And my heart's beating a little bit more, a little bit faster. Those are two ways that I can start and understand what's happening in my system right now, right? And predictably, I'm nervous, but I'm also excited, right? Just because I fidget doesn't mean it's only because I'm nervous. I also fidget when I'm really excited, okay? And so how do I figure out which one it is? Or maybe it's both. I do know that in this moment it's both, because my mind, the thoughts that are going through my mind right now are saying, oh my goodness, this is so fun, this is so good. And oh my goodness, people are watching, this is being recorded, right? So the duality of that helps me to really sift through and understand where I'm at. That's also where I see the predictability coming in. Pretty predictable that when my heart is racing and when I'm feeling really hot in my body, I can go straight up to my emotions and be like, all right, Vanessa, what's happening here? Okay. This is also a really good diagram and way to assess what you need going forward. So had I not picked up on what my body was telling me before I turned my camera on, I would not have been ready with holding my stone. Okay. So, of course, the better we have an understanding of how our system is processing things, then we have a better understanding of what we need, how I can take care of myself. And in how I take care of myself really shows up in my different relationships. Okay. And it's also helpful for me not to mind read and not to think that I know that when someone's presenting in a particular way, like, oh, I already know what's going on with them. No, I might see something in a friend or a partner or a colleague at work and say, oh, they usually do this. They usually start pacing up and down the hallway when they get nervous about a meeting with their supervisor. I might know that, right? Predictably, that's what they usually do, but I don't assume it, right? So that's the piece that we have to be careful with when we're talking about how do I recognize how others are showing up for me and for themselves and approach it with curiosity, right? So for that colleague who's walking up and down the hallway, who's nervous about that meeting with their supervisor, I could go up and just be genuinely calm and curious and say, hey, how are you doing? I'm noticing that you're pacing, right? And just kind of open up that space and be that support, right? I would definitely say that that's one of the pieces that I work really hard to make sure that I am predictable around, is that if I'm noticing something, I try to phrase it as a question, right? I try to be really curious around it and not pretend like I know and not assume things, which is an important exercise too, not just outwardly with the people around us, but also utilizing that curiosity within ourselves, right? So instead of me being frustrated with myself of like, why are you nervous, Vanessa? Right? Like, that's not how the thought process is going. That's not helpful. It would probably send me into further panic. But instead, if I'm using that curiosity and that calmness that I give to those who are around me, and I internalize that and just take in my deep breath and say, okay, Vanessa, what's happening? What do you need? Oh, you're nervous. You'll probably need something to fidget. Okay, let's grab your stone. Right? And from there, we can keep going. I'm actually going to keep that up on the screen for a second and see if anyone has any questions or if you needed some support in navigating through the emotions, mind, behavior, and body in the example that we were doing right now, that you were doing for yourself. Can't see everybody. I'd also love to say, oh, drop it in the chat, but I'm too far from my screen. I can't see it. Okay, no, we're good. Beautiful. Okay. So, real life example, past examples, right? Let's see. What's happening, friends? Okay. I'm just going to stop sharing. Right. So just to recap, we now have a diagram to think about how we can check in on ourselves. We have a diagram on being able to support ourselves in showing up for others in a way, remember, that is curious and in a way that is calm and not assuming. Those for me are really, really important in being able to show up in our relationships, all of them, but also, and most importantly, how we show up for ourselves, which is why at the beginning, I phrased this and I named the presentation Predictability and You, because no matter what relationship we're talking about, at the focal point and at the piece of what you can control and what you can more deeply understand is yourself. And the way that you show up in the world today in this moment is so much smoother and it's so much clearer when we are fully aligned and when we have a better understanding of ourselves, our needs, and our challenges. So that way we can further embrace those who are around us. Or, as you can tell from the first friendship of mine, where we might need to say goodbye. And that's okay, right? So that's everything on my presentation.